The voice that saved, George Strait, the king of country, faces the most dramatic moment of his life. The stage lights dimmed for the final time that evening at the Grand Ole Opry, and 60,000 fans erupted in thunderous applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of Nashville itself. George Strait, the undisputed king of country music, stood at center stage with his trademark white cowboy hat tilted just right, his guitar hanging loose at his side, and that humble smile that had captured hearts for over 4 decades. The roar was deafening, but George had heard it all before. What he hadn't expected was the overwhelming emotion that suddenly gripped his chest as he looked out at the sea of faces, each one singing along to every word of his closing song. At 68 years old, George Harvey Strait had achieved everything a country musician could dream of and more. With over 100 million records sold worldwide, 60 #1 singles, and countless awards lining the walls of his Texas ranch, he had built a legacy that would outlast generations. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like something was ending, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. As he waved his final goodbye and walked backstage, his longtime manager Bobby rushed up with his usual post-show energy. "George, that was incredible. The crowd went absolutely wild for the new songs. I'm telling you, this comeback tour is going to be the biggest thing since your farewell tour 10 years ago." Bobby's excitement was infectious, but George's mind was already elsewhere, thinking about the long drive home to his ranch in Texas, where his wife Norma would be waiting. "You know what, Bobby," George said, removing his hat and running his fingers through his still thick silver hair, "I think I'm going to head home tonight instead of staying at the hotel. Norma's been alone for 3 days while I've been here in Nashville, and I miss her something fierce." Bobby looked surprised. "But George, it's almost midnight. That's a 6-hour drive in the dark. Why don't you fly out in the morning? I've got the jet ready." George shook his head with that familiar determination that had carried him through decades in the music business. "Nah, I want to drive. There's something about being on the road that clears my head, helps me think about the music. Besides, Norma worries when I'm gone too long, and she's been my anchor for over 50 years. I need to get home to her." The truth was, George Strait had always been a man of simple pleasures despite his extraordinary success. While other country stars bought mansions in Nashville or moved to Los Angeles, George had stayed true to his Texas roots. His ranch outside San Antonio wasn't just a home, it was his sanctuary, the place where he could be just George, not the king of country. And at the center of that sanctuary was Norma, his high school sweetheart who had stood by his side through every triumph and challenge. Now, if you've been enjoying this story so far, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and join our community of story lovers. Let me know in the comments what you think will happen next, and tell us where you're listening from. Whether you're in Texas like George or anywhere else in the world, your support means everything to us, and I promise you this story is just getting started with some incredible twists you won't see coming. As George made his way to the parking area behind the venue, he pulled out his phone to call Norma. The familiar sound of her voice after the first ring made his heart skip a beat, just like it had when they were teenagers in high school. "Hey there, handsome." Norma's warm voice came through the speaker. "How did the show go?" "Oh, darling, it was something special tonight. The crowd was so alive, so connected to every song. Made me remember why I fell in love with music in the first place." George climbed into his favorite pickup truck, a well-worn but reliable Ford that he preferred over any fancy tour bus. "I'm heading home now instead of waiting until morning. I need to see you." There was a pause on the other end, and George could picture Norma's concerned expression. She had been married to a touring musician long enough to know the dangers of long drives after emotional shows. "George, honey, are you sure? It's late, and you must be exhausted after that performance." "I'm sure, sweetheart. I've got my coffee, got some good music, and I've got the best reason in the world to get home safe. You." George started the engine and adjusted his mirrors. "Besides, I've been thinking about some new songs, and I do my best thinking on the open road." "Well, you drive careful, you hear me? And call me when you stop for gas." Norma's voice carried that perfect mix of love and gentle authority that had guided their marriage for over 5 decades. "I'll have some of that leftover pot roast warming for you when you get home. I love you, Norma Strait. More today than yesterday, but not as much as tomorrow. I love you too, George. Now get going so you can get home to me sooner." As George pulled out of Nashville and onto the interstate heading west toward Texas, he reflected on how blessed his life had been. The radio played softly in the background, cycling through classic country hits from his peers, Willie Nelson, Merle Haggard, Alan Jackson, each song bringing back memories of friendships, collaborations, and the golden age of country music they had all helped create. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated by his headlights cutting through the darkness. Other cars were sparse at this hour, mostly long-haul truckers making their overnight runs. George appreciated the solitude. It gave him time to process the emotions that had overwhelmed him on stage tonight. There had been something in the audience's response that felt like more than just appreciation for good music. It felt like love, like family, like a connection that transcended entertainment. He thought about his career, how it had started so humbly in the honky-tonk bars of South Texas, playing for crowds of 20 or 30 people who were more interested in their beer than his songs. Now, decades later, he could fill the largest venues in the world, and people would travel thousands of miles just to hear him sing. But success hadn't changed him. Not really. He still preferred his ranch to any mansion, still preferred Norma's home cooking to any fancy restaurant, and still believed that the best country music came from real experiences and genuine emotions. The miles rolled by peacefully as George drove through the Tennessee countryside, then into Alabama, then Mississippi. The truck's heater kept him warm, while classic country played softly on the radio. He found himself humming along to songs he had grown up with, songs that had inspired him to pick up a guitar in the first place. Every now and then, one of his own hits would come on, and he would listen objectively, remembering the day he recorded it, the story behind the lyrics, the people who had helped bring it to life. Around 3 in the morning, as he crossed into Louisiana, George noticed storm clouds gathering in the distance. The weather report had mentioned possible thunderstorms, but he had driven through plenty of storms over the years. A little rain never bothered a Texas rancher. He turned up the radio slightly and pressed on, eager to get home to Norma and the warmth of their bed. What George couldn't see yet was that this storm was different. What he couldn't know was that the next few hours would test everything he thought he knew about strength, love, and survival. The man who had conquered the music world was about to face a battle that would make all of his professional challenges seem trivial, and the woman waiting for him at home, the quiet strength behind his public success, was about to become the hero of the most important song they would ever write together. The storm was moving faster than the weather reports had predicted, and it was heading directly toward the mountain highway that George would need to take to reach Texas. In just a few hours, the king of country music would discover that sometimes the most important performances happen when there's no audience at all, when the only thing that matters is love, courage, and the will to survive. By 4:30 in the morning, George had reached the winding mountain roads that cut through the Arkansas hills toward the Texas border. The storm had caught up with him sooner than expected, and what had started as light drizzle was now becoming a steady downpour. The windshield wipers worked overtime, creating a rhythmic beat that almost matched the country song playing softly on the radio. George turned down the music and leaned forward slightly, gripping the steering wheel with both hands as visibility decreased with each passing mile. He had driven these roads countless times over the decades, traveling between Nashville and his ranch for recording sessions, award shows, and touring commitments. Every curve, every hill, every mile marker was familiar territory. But tonight, in the darkness and rain, even familiar roads could become treacherous. George reduced his speed and turned on his hazard lights, focusing intently on the yellow center line that was becoming harder to see through the increasingly heavy rainfall. His phone buzzed with a text message from Norma, checking on his progress, but George didn't dare take his eyes off the road to read it. The responsible thing to do would be to pull over at the next rest stop and wait for the storm to pass, but something inside him urged him to keep driving. Maybe it was the excitement from the show still running through his veins, or maybe it was just the deep longing to get home to the woman he loved. Either way, George Strait pressed on through the storm, unaware that fate was about to test him in ways he had never imagined. The rain intensified dramatically as he climbed higher into the mountains, transforming from a steady downpour into a torrential deluge that overwhelmed his truck's windshield wipers. Lightning illuminated the sky in brilliant white flashes, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very mountains around him. George had lived in Texas his whole life and was no stranger to severe weather, but this storm felt different, more violent and unpredictable than anything he had experienced on the road. As he navigated a particularly sharp curve, George's headlights caught something that made his blood run cold. Through the sheets of rain, he could see the tail lights of a massive 18-wheeler jackknifed across both lanes of the narrow mountain highway. The truck had apparently lost control on the slick pavement and was now blocking the entire road. Its trailer twisted at a dangerous angle that made it impossible for any vehicle to pass safely. George immediately began to brake, but the wet pavement offered little traction. His pickup truck began to slide sideways as he fought to maintain control, the steering wheel seeming to have a mind of its own as the vehicle hydroplaned on the rain-soaked asphalt. Time seemed to slow down as George realized he was going to hit the jackknife truck no matter what he did. In that split second of clarity that comes in moments of extreme danger, he made a decision that would save both his life and the life of the truck driver who was trapped in the cab ahead of him. Instead of trying to stop completely, George steered his truck toward the narrow shoulder on the right side of the road, threading the needle between the jackknifed trailer and a steep embankment. His truck scraped along the guardrail in a shower of sparks, metal grinding against metal, but he managed to squeeze past the accident without hitting the disabled 18-wheeler. However, his momentum carried him too far, and his truck broke through the damaged guardrail and began rolling down the steep wooded slope beside the highway. The world became a chaotic tumble of motion, sound, and terror as George's pickup truck rolled over and over down the hillside. His seatbelt held him in place, but everything loose in the cab became a projectile. His cowboy hat flew off, his coffee cup shattered against the dashboard, and his guitar case in the back seat slammed around like a battering ram. The truck rolled at least 4 times before finally coming to rest against a large oak tree. The passenger side crushed against the trunk, while the driver's side faced upward toward the stormy sky. For a moment, everything was silent except for the sound of rain pelting the undercarriage of the overturned truck and the distant rumble of thunder. George hung suspended in his seatbelt, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, his left arm screaming in pain from what was obviously a broken bone, but he was alive, conscious, and able to move. As the shock began to wear off, his first thought wasn't about his own injuries or the destroyed truck that had been his faithful companion for so many years. His first thought was a prayer of gratitude that Norma hadn't been with him, that she was safe at home, probably asleep in their bed, unaware of the nightmare that had just unfolded on a lonely mountain road in Arkansas. George tried to reach for his phone to call for help, but the movement sent lightning bolts of pain through his injured arm. The phone had been thrown somewhere in the cab during the rollover, and in the darkness, he couldn't see where it had landed. He was trapped, injured, and alone on a mountainside during one of the worst storms he had ever experienced. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who had sung about heartbreak and hardship for 4 decades was now living through the most terrifying experience of his life. But George Strait hadn't become the king of country music by giving up when things got tough. Despite the pain and fear, he began to assess his situation with the methodical thinking that had guided him through every challenge in his career. The truck was stable against the tree, so he wasn't in immediate danger of rolling further down the hill. His injuries were painful, but not life-threatening, and most importantly, he had something to live for that was worth fighting through any amount of pain or difficulty. As he hung there in the darkness, listening to the storm rage around him, George began to sing softly to himself. Not one of his hit songs, but an old hymn his mother had taught him as a child, a song about finding strength in the darkest moments. His voice, though weakened by shock and pain, still carried that pure, clear tone that had made him famous. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the storm, he could hear the sound of sirens approaching the jackknifed truck on the highway above, which meant help was coming, even if it might take them a while to find him down in the woods. The sirens grew louder as emergency vehicles arrived at the scene of the jackknifed 18-wheeler. George could see flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the rain-soaked leaves above him, creating an almost surreal light show in the forest canopy. He tried to call out, but his voice was weak and the storm was too loud for anyone to hear him from such a distance. The rescue workers would be focused on the truck driver first, which was exactly as it should be, but George knew it might be hours before they realized another vehicle had been involved in the accident. Time moved differently when you were hanging upside down in a wrecked truck during a thunderstorm. Minutes felt like hours, and George found himself drifting between consciousness and a strange, dreamlike state, where memories of his life with Norma played like scenes from a movie. He remembered their first date in high school, when he was so nervous he could barely speak. He remembered their wedding day, when she looked so beautiful in her simple white dress that he almost forgot his vows. He remembered the birth of their children, the early years of struggling to make it in the music business, and the night he got his first #1 hit. Through all of those memories, one constant remained: Norma's unwavering faith in him. She had believed in his music when record labels rejected him. She had supported their family when he was playing for $20 tips in honky-tonk bars. She had celebrated his successes without ever letting fame change who they were as people. And now, as George hung in that wrecked truck, he realized that all of his professional achievements meant nothing compared to the love they had built together over 53 years of marriage. The pain in his arm was getting worse, and George was beginning to feel dizzy from the blood loss. He knew he needed medical attention soon, but he also knew that panicking would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on staying conscious and alert, using techniques he had learned from his military service decades earlier. He controlled his breathing, moved his fingers and toes to make sure nothing was paralyzed, and kept his mind active by planning what he would say to Norma when he finally got home. Above him, on the highway, he could hear voices shouting over the storm. The rescue workers had apparently gotten the truck driver out of his cab and were now securing the scene. George tried once more to call for help, mustering every bit of strength he had left to project his voice through the rain and wind. This time someone heard him. "Did you hear that?" a voice called out. "I think someone's down in the woods." "Are you sure? It could just be the wind," another voice replied. "No, I heard someone calling for help. We need to check it out." George's heart leaped with hope as he heard footsteps crashing through the underbrush above him. He called out again, and this time his voice was stronger, powered by the knowledge that rescue was finally at hand. A flashlight beam swept across the forest, then another, and then suddenly a bright light was shining directly on his overturned truck. "Holy cow, there's a pickup down here," the rescuer shouted. "We need the jaws of life and a backboard. This guy's trapped pretty good." Within minutes, the quiet forest was filled with the sounds of organized chaos as the rescue team mobilized to extract George from his demolished truck. A paramedic rappelled down the slope and squeezed through the driver's side window to assess George's condition. The young man's eyes went wide when his flashlight illuminated George's face. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" the paramedic asked, though George could see in his expression that he had already recognized the king of country music. "George Strait," George replied weakly. "And before you ask, yes, I'm that George Strait. But right now I'm just a guy who needs some help getting out of this mess." The paramedic smiled despite the seriousness of the situation. "Well, Mr. Strait, my name is Jake, and I'm going to take good care of you. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" "My left arm is definitely broken, and I've got a cut on my head that's bleeding pretty good. Other than that, I think I'm okay. Just dizzy from hanging upside down for so long." Jake quickly examined George's injuries, while the rescue team above prepared their equipment. "You're right about the arm, and you've definitely got a concussion. But considering what this truck looks like, you're incredibly lucky to be alive. That tree probably saved your life by stopping your roll." As the rescue workers carefully extracted George from the wreckage, he couldn't help but think about how this accident would change everything. Not just his immediate plans for touring and recording, but his entire perspective on what really mattered in life. He had spent decades chasing musical perfection, crafting the perfect song, delivering the perfect performance. But hanging in that truck, facing the possibility of death, he had realized that none of that mattered as much as getting home to tell Norma he loved her one more time. The ambulance ride to the nearest hospital was a blur of flashing lights, medical equipment, and concerned voices on radio dispatchers coordinating his care. Jake, the paramedic, stayed by his side the entire time, monitoring his vital signs and keeping him conscious with conversation about music and life in Arkansas. But George's thoughts were entirely focused on Norma and the phone call that would soon shatter her peaceful sleep with news that would change both of their lives forever. When they reached the hospital, George was rushed into the emergency room where a team of doctors and nurses immediately began working to stabilize his condition. The broken arm would need surgery, the head wound required stitches, and they wanted to run tests to make sure there were no internal injuries from the violent rollover. But first, George made one request that overrode all medical protocols. "I need to call my wife," he told the head nurse. "She's at home in Texas, and she's going to be worried sick when she finds out what happened. Please, before you do anything else, help me call Norma." The nurse, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, handed him her personal cell phone without hesitation. "Of course, Mr. Strait," But after this call, you need to let us take care of you properly." George's hands shook as he dialed the familiar number, partly from his injuries and partly from the knowledge that he was about to give the woman he loved the worst scare of her life. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, before Norma's sleepy voice answered. "Hello? Norma, darling, it's me," George said, trying to keep his voice steady. "George? Honey, what time is it? Are you home already?" "No, sweetheart, I'm not home yet. I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm, okay? I've been in an accident." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. George could picture Norma sitting up in bed, her hand flying to her chest the way it always did when she was frightened. After 53 years of marriage, he knew every one of her reactions, every gesture, every expression that would cross her face in moments of crisis. "George?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "How bad? Where are you?" "I'm in a hospital in Arkansas, darling. My truck rolled off the road during that storm, but I'm alive and I'm going to be okay. I've got a broken arm and some cuts, but nothing that won't heal." George tried to sound stronger than he felt, knowing that Norma would hear every nuance in his voice and worry about the things he wasn't telling her. "Oh my God, George, I'm coming to get you right now." "What hospital? I'll drive through the night." "No, honey, you listen to me," George interrupted gently but firmly. "The storm is still bad out here, and these roads are dangerous. I need you to wait until morning, then fly up here. I'm not going anywhere, and I need to know you're safe at home until then." Norma was quiet for a moment, and George knew she was fighting between her overwhelming desire to rush to his side and her practical understanding that he was right about the dangers of traveling in the storm. It was one of the things he loved most about her. Even in crisis, she could think clearly and make good decisions. "Okay," she finally said, though her voice was thick with unshed tears. "But I want to talk to your doctor. I want to know exactly what your injuries are, and I want them to call me with any updates. And George?" "Yes, darling. I love you more than life itself. You get yourself healed up, you hear me? I've got too many more years planned with you to let you go anywhere." After George handed the phone to Dr. Patricia Williams, the emergency room physician who would be overseeing his care, he watched as the medical team sprang into action around him. The efficiency and professionalism of the staff was impressive, but George found himself thinking about something entirely different. Hanging in that truck for hours, facing the possibility that he might die without seeing Norma again, had fundamentally changed something inside him. All the accolades, all the sold-out concerts, all the industry recognition, none of it mattered compared to the simple joy of hearing his wife's voice tell him she loved him. "Doctor." Williams finished her conversation with Norma and returned to George's bedside. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of calm competence that only came from decades of handling medical emergencies. "Your wife is quite a lady, Mr. Strait. She asked better questions about your condition than most medical students would think to ask. She's been taking care of me for over 50 years, Doc. She knows more about keeping me healthy than I do." George winced as the nurse started an IV in his good arm. "What's the verdict? How long before I can get back on stage?" Dr. Williams smiled at his priorities. "Let's focus on getting you stable first. Then we'll worry about your performance schedule. The orthopedic surgeon is on his way in to look at your arm. It's a clean break, which is good news, but it's going to need surgery and several months of healing. The head injury is our bigger concern right now. We need to do a CT scan to make sure there's no bleeding or swelling in your brain." As the medical team wheeled George toward the radiology department, he caught a glimpse of himself in the reflection of a window. His face was pale, his silver hair matted with dried blood, and his left arm was immobilized in a temporary splint. He looked like he had been through hell, which he supposed he had. But he was alive, and that was more than he had any right to expect after rolling a pickup truck down a mountainside. The CT scan took what felt like hours, though George knew it was probably only 30 minutes. The enclosed space and the mechanical sounds of the machine reminded him uncomfortably of being trapped in the overturned truck, but he forced himself to stay calm by thinking about the songs he wanted to write about this experience. Not the terrifying parts, but the profound realization of what truly mattered in life. He had a feeling this accident would inspire some of the most meaningful music of his entire career. When Dr. Williams returned with the results, her expression was serious but not alarming. "The good news is that there's no bleeding or dangerous swelling in your brain. The bad news is that you have a significant concussion, and you're going to need several days of observation before we can safely discharge you. Head injuries in people over 65 can be unpredictable, and we want to make absolutely sure you're stable before you go home." "Several days?" George tried to sit up straighter in the hospital bed, then immediately regretted it as his head began to spin. "Doc, I've got shows scheduled next week, and my wife is going to want to take me home as soon as possible." "Mr. Strait, with all due respect to your schedule, you nearly died tonight. Your body needs time to heal, and your brain needs time to recover from the trauma. Those shows will have to wait." Dr. Williams pulled up a chair beside his bed, settling in for what was clearly going to be a longer conversation. "But there's something else we need to discuss. When we did your blood work and imaging studies, we discovered some things that aren't related to your accident." George felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. "What kind of things?" "Your blood work shows some cardiac enzymes that are elevated, and your EKG has some irregularities that suggest you've had some heart damage recently. Have you been experiencing any chest pain, shortness of breath, or unusual fatigue during your performances?" George thought back over the past few months of touring. There had been moments when he felt more winded than usual, after particularly energetic shows, times when he had to sit down between songs more often than he used to, but he had attributed that to age and the natural effects of decades of performing. The possibility that something more serious might be wrong had never occurred to him. "Maybe some tiredness after shows, but I figured that was just because I'm not 25 anymore," George admitted. "Are you saying I've had a heart attack?" "We think you may have had what we call a silent heart attack sometime in the recent past. It's not uncommon in men your age, especially those under stress or with demanding physical schedules. The good news is that it appears to have been relatively minor, but it's something we need to address immediately. We're going to keep you here for several more days to run additional cardiac tests and make sure your heart is stable." George stared at the ceiling tiles, trying to process this new information. First the accident, now heart problems he didn't even know he had. It seemed like the universe was conspiring to force him to slow down and pay attention to things he had been ignoring. And the thing that scared him most wasn't the possibility of dying. It was the possibility of leaving Norma alone after all these years together. "Does my wife need to know about the heart situation right now?" George asked. "She's already scared enough about the accident." Dr. Williams considered this carefully. "I think she needs to know because she'll be involved in your care and recovery. But we can present it in a way that emphasizes the positive, that we caught it early, that it's treatable, and that the accident might have actually saved your life by bringing you to medical attention when you otherwise might not have sought it." As if on cue, George's phone rang. Norma's name appeared on the caller ID, and he knew she wouldn't be able to sleep until she heard his voice again. He answered with his good hand, already planning how to tell her about this latest development without causing her more worry than necessary. "Hey, beautiful," he said, trying to inject some normalcy into his voice. "I was just thinking about you. I've been lying here staring at the ceiling, George. I can't stop thinking about what could have happened. Are you in pain? Are the doctors taking good care of you?" "The pain's not too bad with the medication they gave me, and the doctors and nurses here are wonderful. But darling, there's something else we need to talk about." George took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would be among the most difficult of their marriage. "When they ran tests to check on my injuries, they found something else. Something that's actually good news, even though it might not sound like it at first." The silence stretched so long that George wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Norma's voice came through, steady but strained. "Tell me, George. Whatever it is, we'll face it together like we always have. They found evidence that I had a heart attack recently, probably sometime in the last few months. A silent one that I didn't even know happened. But here's the thing, sweetheart. If I hadn't had this accident, if they hadn't run these tests tonight, it might have gone undiagnosed until it was too late to do anything about it." George heard Norma's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded suspiciously like a sob being stifled. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion but remarkably composed. "So you're telling me that this terrible accident that nearly killed you might have actually saved your life?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. The doctors say it's treatable, that with the right medication and some changes to my lifestyle, I can live a normal, healthy life for many more years. But Norma, if we hadn't caught this now—" George didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood what he meant. "I'm booking the first flight out in the morning," Norma said with the quiet determination that had carried them through every crisis in their 53-year marriage. "And George, I want you to promise me something. Anything, darling. Promise me that when you get out of that hospital, we're going to have a long talk about what really matters in our lives, This accident, this heart condition, it's a wake-up call. We're not getting any younger, and I want to make sure we're spending our time on the things that truly matter. 3 days later, Norma arrived at the Arkansas hospital like a force of nature wrapped in a gentle exterior. She had coordinated with George's management team to postpone his upcoming shows, arranged for their adult children to help manage the ranch, and somehow found time to pack enough supplies to establish a temporary base camp in George's hospital room. The nurses quickly learned that nothing happened regarding George Strait's care without Norma's knowledge and approval, but they also discovered that she brought homemade cookies for the staff and remembered everyone's names and personal details. Dr. Williams had never seen a patient recover as quickly as George did once Norma arrived. His vital signs stabilized, his pain decreased, and his overall demeanor brightened dramatically. It was a testament to the power of love and partnership that the medical team found both inspiring and slightly miraculous. "Your husband is remarkably lucky, Mrs. Strait," Dr. Williams explained as she went over George's treatment plan. "The heart damage is minimal, and with the medication regimen we're starting him on, plus some dietary changes and moderate exercise, his prognosis is excellent. The accident injuries are healing beautifully, and he should make a complete recovery." Norma squeezed George's good hand as she listened to the doctor's explanation. "What about his music career? Will he be able to continue performing?" "Absolutely, but with some modifications. No more 6-hour drives through thunderstorms," Dr. Williams said with a smile. "And probably shorter performance sets, at least initially. His body has been through significant trauma, and it will take time to build back his stamina." That evening, as they sat together in the quiet hospital room, George and Norma had the conversation she had asked for. A deep, honest discussion about their priorities, their dreams, and how they wanted to spend whatever time they had left together. It was a conversation that would fundamentally change the direction of George's career and their life together. "You know what I kept thinking about when I was trapped in that truck?" George said, his voice soft in the dimmed room. "I kept thinking about all the small moments we've shared that meant more to me than any #1 hit or sold-out stadium. The quiet mornings on the ranch, the way you hum while you're cooking, the conversations we have on the front porch at sunset." Norma wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I've been thinking the same thing, George. We've been blessed with an incredible life, but we've also sacrificed a lot for your career. Maybe it's time to find a different balance. I want to keep making music, but I want to make it matter more. I want to use whatever platform I have left to help people, to make a real difference in the world." George shifted in his bed, wincing slightly from his still healing injuries. "That truck driver who jackknifed on the highway, I found out he's okay, but he told the police he'd been driving for 18 hours straight because he couldn't afford to stop and rest. There are people out there struggling just to survive, and maybe I can do something about that." Over the following weeks, as George recovered at home on their Texas ranch, they began developing a plan that would honor both his musical legacy and their desire to make a meaningful impact. They researched rural healthcare challenges, spoke with community leaders across the country, and consulted with medical professionals about the best ways to address the healthcare desert that existed in many of America's small towns and farming communities. The idea that emerged was revolutionary in its simplicity. Mobile medical units that would travel to rural communities, providing basic healthcare services, preventive screenings, and health education to people who otherwise had limited access to medical care. George would fund the initial program through a special concert tour, with all proceeds going directly to purchase and equip the mobile units. 6 months after the accident, George Strait returned to the stage for the first time. The venue was deliberately chosen, a small theater in the Arkansas town nearest to where his accident had occurred. The audience included many of the first responders who had saved his life, along with members of the community who would benefit from the first mobile medical unit. When George walked onto that stage, his left arm still bearing faint scars from his surgery, the audience rose in thunderous applause. But the applause wasn't just for the king of country music. It was for a man who had faced his own mortality and chosen to use his second chance to serve others. 6 months ago, not far from here, I had what I thought was the worst night of my life, George said into the microphone, his voice carrying the same pure, clear tone that had made him famous, but now enriched with deeper meaning. "My truck rolled off the highway during a storm, and I honestly wasn't sure I was going to see another sunrise. But sometimes what looks like the worst thing that could happen to you turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to you." He gestured to Norma, who was sitting in the front row with tears streaming down her face. "That accident saved my life in more ways than one. It led to the discovery of a heart condition I didn't know I had. But more importantly, it reminded me that the most important song you can ever sing is the one that helps another person, and the most important stage you can ever perform on is the one where you make a difference in someone else's life." The concert that night raised over $2 million, launching what would become a nationwide network of mobile medical units that would eventually serve thousands of rural communities across America. George continued touring, but with a new purpose and a new message. His music became more personal, more meaningful, and paradoxically, more popular than it had been in years. The accident had stripped away everything unnecessary and revealed what had always been at the core of George Strait's character: humility, love, and a genuine desire to serve others. The king of country music had found his true kingdom, and it wasn't measured in record sales or concert tickets, but in lives saved and communities served. Years later, when people asked George about the secret to his longevity and continued success, he would always give the same answer: "Sometimes you have to lose control of the wheel to find out where you're really supposed to be going." That accident didn't end my career. It showed me what my career was really supposed to be about. And Norma, his constant companion through it all, would smile and add, "Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most broken instruments." George just had to get broken a little bit to find his most important song. The story of that stormy night in Arkansas became legend in country music circles, but for George and Norma Strait, it was simply the beginning of the most meaningful chapter of their lives together. They had learned that true success isn't measured by what you achieve for yourself, but by what you give to others. And in the end, the voice that had entertained millions found its greatest purpose in the service of saving lives, one small community at a time.